Have you ever spent your entire life believing you know your own story, only to discover it's a lie? That's exactly what happened to me. For years, I lived in what seemed like an innocent web of secrets, until a single revelation changed absolutely everything. The person I called my sister was, in reality, my mother. Sounds like something out of a soap opera, doesn't it? But that was my life, filled with emotional twists, family drama, and, of course, a lot of pain. But what would you do if suddenly everything you thought you knew about yourself was thrown into doubt? How do you rebuild your identity when its very foundation is shaken by such a shocking truth? And above all, how do you forgive the ones you love the most when the hurt seems insurmountable? In this video, I'm sharing every detail of my journey, from the devastating discovery to the healing process that transformed my life. If this story already has you intrigued, hit the like button and subscribe to my channel because this is just the tip of the iceberg. And tell me in the comments below, what's the most surprising family secret you've ever uncovered? Let's talk about it. Some stories start so ordinarily that you'd never imagine they would change everything you know as normal. Mine began on a regular morning as I brewed coffee and gazed out the window, trying to organize my thoughts. At that moment, I was just another person living the quiet routine of a small town, surrounded by my family and, of course, my older sister, Camila. Ever since I could remember, Camila had always been there, the dedicated, caring sister who seemed to have answers to everything. But even with that close bond, there had always been something that didn't quite add up. Camila and I had a considerable age gap, more than 15 years, and maybe because of that our relationship was more maternal than sibling-like. She took care of me in a way that sometimes made me question whether our roles were reversed. While my friends complained about their parents' strictness, I had Camila, the person who patiently taught me how to do my homework or navigate the first dilemmas of adolescence. She carried a weight I was too young to understand at the time. My world was small, as it often is in small towns. Our parents were firm but distant figures, and Camila, in many ways, filled that void. However, as I grew older, I began to notice certain inconsistencies. Conversations about our family's past were always vague, as if something was being carefully omitted. Old photos, for example, were scarce, and when they did surface, they often showed Camila with a strange mix of joy and melancholy in her expression. I tried asking about these details, but the answers were always evasive. One day, I found a photo in the back of my mother's closet, one of those faded, low-quality pictures with yellowed edges. It was of Camila holding a baby, her smile so nervous it looked more like a cry for help than an expression of happiness. The strange part: there was no mention of this photo in our family stories. When I asked my mother about it, she simply laughed and said Camila had always loved taking care of me when I was little. Something about the way she avoided the topic left me uneasy, but not enough to press further. As the clues piled up, my curiosity grew. There were also strange comments from older neighbors. At a family gathering at Aunt Marta's house, I overheard someone say, "Camila was so young when it all happened." What was it? I asked Camila directly, and she just shook her head with that serene smile she always used to avoid hard conversations. "Some things don't need explaining, they're just felt," she said. And at the time I accepted that, at least for a while. But one specific moment became the real catalyst for my doubts. While rummaging through a box of keepsakes in the attic, I found an envelope full of old documents. Among them was a birth certificate, mine. And where my mother's name should have been, it was crossed out, as if deliberately erased. My heart froze, but I didn't want to believe it meant anything. I decided to ignore it and pretend I hadn't seen it. But once something starts gnawing at your mind, it's impossible to go back to how things were before. And so, that ordinary day when I was just having coffee, turned out to be the beginning of one of the biggest twists in my life. What I didn't know was that the answers I was searching for were much closer, and far more painful, than I could have imagined. It's funny how you only notice the details once everything has already happened. It's like rewatching a movie knowing the ending. You start to pick up on all the little clues that were there the whole time, but you just missed them. When I began revisiting my past to understand the family secrets surrounding me, everything started to painfully fall into place. Camila had always been different. Not just because of her excessive care for me, but because of how she avoided talking about herself. While everyone else in our family shared stories of their accomplishments, struggles, and even disagreements, Camila always redirected the attention back to me. I remember one Christmas when my grandmother asked why Camila had never married or had kids. The silence that filled the room was almost tangible. Camila simply smiled nervously and replied, "I have Manu. I don't need anything else." At the time I thought it was sweet. Now I see it was so much more than that. Then there were the moments when my mother and Camila would exchange glances, almost like they were having a silent conversation. It was theatrical in a way, something I couldn't understand as a child but now recognize as an unspoken agreement between them, a pact to keep a secret I had no clue existed. I recall one heated argument where my mother shouted, "You'll never understand what Camila sacrificed for you." Those words stuck with me like a thorn in my mind. I wanted to ask what she meant, but I never had the courage. The physical clues were even more unsettling. When I was 15, I found a box hidden in Camila's closet. Inside were old photographs of her. Pregnant. Yes, pregnant. I was confused because I had no idea she had ever had a child. I thought about confronting her but ultimately decided it wasn't my business. Besides, the idea of Camila being a mother was so absurd to me that I dismissed it without question. How could she be my sister, the person who had always been like a second mother to me? Another memory surfaced, overhearing a conversation between my Aunt Marta and a neighbor. They mentioned how my mother adopted Camila's baby. My heart nearly stopped. Adopted Camila's baby. I thought I was hallucinating. Sounded ridiculous. Didn't make sense. I tried to forget, but as they say, once you know something, even subconsciously, you can never unlearn it. Even the family photo albums started to seem suspicious. Camila was in every picture with me, always holding my hand or carrying me. My mother, on the other hand, seemed distant, almost like a background character in my childhood. When I showed one of these albums to my cousin one day, she joked, "You look more like Camila's daughter than your mom's." We laughed at the time, but now those words feel eerily prophetic. Then there was the way Camila looked at me. It wasn't just the love of a sister. It was something deeper, something I couldn't understand back then. It was a gaze filled with pride, mixed with guilt and a hint of sadness. As if she knew something I didn't. And of course she did. These pieces started coming together in a way that was almost terrifying. It felt like my entire past was screaming for attention, begging me to see the truth that had been right in front of me all along. Yet part of me didn't want to know. After all, what do you do when you realize your own life story might be a lie? That's when I decided I needed answers. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was time to investigate, even if it meant uncovering truths I wasn't ready to face. Have you ever reached a point where you just couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore? That's exactly where I found myself. I couldn't ignore the whispers, the half-finished conversations, or the heavy, secret-laden glances. It was as though an invisible force was pulling me toward the truth, even though deep down, I wasn't sure I wanted to face it. And so my search began, a journey that unearthed everything I thought I knew about my life. The first step was to revisit the past. To make sense of the present, I had to go back to the beginning. I started at my parents' house, that seemingly static, safe place. I went straight to the attic, a dusty space filled with boxes of memories. I can't explain it, but something told me the answers were there, hidden among the faded photos and old documents. And I was right. The first discovery was an envelope full of Camila's medical records. Among them was a hospital admission note from 25 years ago, stating, "Normal delivery." My heart raced. Didn't make sense. Camila never had children. Or at least that's what I'd always been told. But if she'd given birth, where was this child? And why had no one ever spoken about it? I held that paper in my hands, feeling a mix of panic and excitement. It was as if I had opened the first door to a labyrinth of secrets. But this was just the beginning. The more I searched, the stranger things became. I found handwritten letters exchanged between my mother and Camila. In one of them, my mother wrote, "Don't worry. I'll do whatever it takes to protect you and Manu," my childhood nickname. Those words echoed in my mind like a thunderclap. It was as if all the puzzle pieces were starting to align, yet the picture was still painfully incomplete. I needed more answers, so I turned to other family members. My Aunt Marta, who was never great at keeping secrets, seemed like the perfect person to ask. "Auntie, do you remember anything unusual about when I was a baby?" I tried to sound casual. She gave me a look I'll never forget, as if she'd seen a ghost. "Why are you asking about that now?" she replied, clearly uncomfortable. I pressed her, saying I was just curious, and that's when she muttered something chilling. "Manu, there are things better left unknown." But that only made me more determined. If there was something everyone was trying to hide, I needed to find it. That's when I decided to talk to the older neighbors, the ones who had been around when I was little. I found Mrs. Lucia, a long-time friend of my mother's. When I asked if she remembered anything unusual about the time I was born, she hesitated before saying, "All I know is that your mother went through a lot because of Camila back then. But that was so long ago. It's best to leave the past in the past." My frustration grew. I knew there was something big here, but no one seemed willing to talk. That's when I resorted to another tactic. I went back to my parents' house when no one was home and searched places I'd never looked before. That's when I found the biggest clue of all, a diary. It was Camila's, and the first few pages left me trembling. Today was the hardest day of my life. Looking at my daughter and knowing I can't call her mine is a pain I'll never overcome. I stopped breathing for a moment. My daughter. Was she talking about me? I kept reading, each line more devastating than the last. Camila described how she'd gotten pregnant at a young age, how the judgment from our family and society forced her to hand over the responsibility to my parents. She wrote about sleepless nights and the guilt that consumed her for not being able to be my mother in truth. The truth was there, raw and undeniable, staring me in the face. I was Camila's daughter, not her sister. My mind spiraled into a storm of thoughts. Everything made sense now, the looks, the comments, the strange behaviors. But at the same time, nothing made sense. Why hide this from me? Why construct such an elaborate lie? I closed the diary tightly and sat on the floor, trying to process what I had just uncovered. I don't know how long I stayed there, but when I finally stood up, I knew I needed more answers. The diary explained a lot, but there were still so many gaps, so many whys. It was time to confront the one person who could give me the full story. Camila. Confronting Camila was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. After everything I had uncovered, the diary, the medical records, the uneasy glances, and the evasive answers, I knew I couldn't keep living under the weight of so many questions. I needed to face the truth head-on. But more importantly, I needed to hear it from her. Why had she hidden this from me? What had really happened? I waited until a Sunday, knowing she'd be home. My nerves were so bad that it felt like my heart might pound its way out of my chest. My hands trembled as I parked in front of her house. Before knocking on the door, I took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing what I wanted to say. But, as always, nothing went as planned. When Camila opened the door and saw me, I could tell she knew. I didn't have to say anything. It was as if the secret she had been holding for so many years was written all over my face. "Manu." "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I forced myself to step inside, shut the door behind me, and went straight to the point. "You're my mother, aren't you?" The silence that followed was deafening. For a few seconds, Camila just looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. Then she sat down on the couch, covering her face with her hands, and began to cry. I had never seen her like this before. Camila had always been the strong one, the steady one. But at that moment she looked completely broken. Finally she whispered, "I always knew this day would come, but I never imagined it would be this hard." What followed was the most intense and emotional conversation of my life. Camila began to tell her story, pausing often to catch her breath and wipe away her tears. She was only 17 when she got pregnant with me. It was a time of fear, shame, and judgment, especially in our small conservative town. Back then, an unmarried pregnancy was scandalous. Our parents, strict and deeply concerned about appearances, decided the only solution was for everyone to believe I was their child. Camila explained that she didn't have a choice. She wanted to raise me to be my mother, but she was pressured into agreeing to the arrangement. "I just wanted you to have a normal life, without carrying the weight of my mistakes," she said, her voice trembling. Hearing this was painful, but I could understand her intentions. That didn't mean I agreed with them, though. As she spoke, flashes of my childhood came rushing back. Moments when her love for me felt almost maternal. Like the way she was always there for me when I was sick, or how she celebrated my successes as if they were her own. Camila wasn't just a dedicated sister. She was silently taking on the role of a mother. And that realization hurt. Because even with all the love she gave me, I couldn't shake the feeling that my entire life had been built on a lie. At one point I asked, my voice shaking with anger, "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me grow up believing in this lie?" She paused, her face etched with guilt before saying, "I was afraid of losing you, Manu. Afraid you'd hate me for not fighting harder to be your mother." And as time went on, the secret grew too big. "I didn't know how to tell you anymore." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. For the first time, I could see how much she had suffered. This wasn't just my story, it was hers too. But knowing that didn't make my pain any less real. I felt betrayed, lost. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, was shattered. Camila also revealed how the decision to hide the truth had affected our entire family. My father, who had always been distant, had been trying to cope with the guilt of lying for so many years. My mother had thrown herself into playing the role of the perfect mom to shield me from the truth. They had all made choices they believed were for the best, but no one seemed to have thought about the impact this would have when the truth finally came out. When the conversation finally ended, after hours of crying, explanations, and long, painful silences, I felt drained. I didn't know what to think or feel. Part of me wanted to hug Camila and tell her everything would be okay, but another part was deeply hurt. How do you rebuild a relationship after something like this? I left her house that day with my mind racing and my heart heavy. I knew it wouldn't be easy to process everything. The secret had been revealed, but the wounds were still raw, and I had no idea where to even begin healing them. In the days that followed, the pain of the revelation hit me like waves crashing on a shore, unrelenting and overwhelming. Knowing that Camila, the person I trusted most, had kept such a monumental secret from me was suffocating. It wasn't just the discovery that she was my mother, it was everything that came with it. Every memory, every shared moment now carried a different weight, a layer of meaning I couldn't fully comprehend. I spent countless nights replaying scenes from my childhood in my mind, trying to piece together a timeline I hadn't known existed. I thought about every time Camila had been there for me, when I was sick, scared, or just needed guidance. She hadn't just been a sister. She had been a mother in every way that mattered. And yet, that realization hurt. It hurt because even with all the love she gave me, I felt like I had lived a lie. In the days after the revelation, the pain felt like an unshakable storm. It came in waves, some smaller, some overwhelming, each bringing fresh feelings of betrayal, confusion, and sadness. Knowing that Camila, the one person I trusted most in my life, had hidden such a monumental secret from me felt suffocating. This wasn't just about finding out she was my mother. It was about everything that came with that realization. Every memory we shared now felt tainted, layered with new meanings that I wasn't sure how to process. I found myself revisiting moments from my childhood over and over, searching for signs I might have missed. I thought about how Camila had always been there when I was sick, how she supported me through school challenges, and how she celebrated every little accomplishment of mine as if it were her own. She had always been more than a sister, but knowing she was my mother brought a strange, painful clarity to it all. It made sense now, but it didn't make it easier. One memory in particular haunted me. I was around 13 years old when I asked Camila why she never had kids. She smiled, a bittersweet expression I now understood, and said, "Because I've chosen to love you as if you were my own." At the time I thought she was just being a doting sister. Now those words hit me differently. She wasn't just being kind. She was telling the truth in the only way she knew how, wrapped in a secret she couldn't fully share. And then there was the weight of the lie itself. For years I believed my parents were my real mother and father, that our family was what it seemed. But that belief was gone now. My parents, who were supposed to be my protectors, had played a part in hiding my real identity. I felt angry, but more than that I felt lost. It was as if the foundation of my life had been pulled out from under me, leaving me floating in an endless void of questions. The physical evidence of the lie became unbearable to look at. Family albums that once brought joy now felt like proof of the deception. Pictures of Camila holding me as a baby, always with that protective yet melancholic gaze, suddenly seemed full of secrets. My parents stood in the background of most photos, distant figures who were supposed to be the center of my childhood. I couldn't help but wonder, did they ever think about how this would affect me? Or did they believe the truth would stay buried forever? One particularly painful discovery was a photo of Camila at what I now realized was her baby shower. She was standing next to my mother, holding her pregnant belly with a forced smile. The look in her eyes wasn't joy, it was fear and sadness. I couldn't stop staring at it, trying to imagine what she must have been feeling at that moment. It was clear that she hadn't wanted to give me up, but she had felt she had no choice. That realization hurt even more because it made me see her as both the perpetrator of the lie and a victim of it. The betrayal wasn't limited to Camila. My parents' role in this weighed heavily on me too. I couldn't understand how they justified hiding my true identity from me for so long. They always taught me the importance of honesty, yet they had built my entire life on a lie. I remember asking my mother, "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Her response was one I'll never forget. "We thought we were protecting you, Manu. We thought this was the best way to give you a happy life. But how could hiding the truth ever be for my happiness?" As much as I tried to make sense of their reasoning, I couldn't let go of the anger. They may have believed they were doing the right thing, but their decision robbed me of the chance to know who I truly was. I felt like a stranger in my own life, as though the person I thought I was no longer existed. Rebuilding from that felt impossible. The hardest part of all was knowing that Camila had carried the weight of this secret for so many years. She had sacrificed so much, watching someone else take on the role of mother while she stood in the shadows. I thought about the guilt and pain she must have lived with every day. She wasn't just my sister who had lied to me. She was a young girl who had been forced to make an impossible choice. And while I could empathize with her pain, it didn't make mine any easier to bear. Some nights, I found myself staring at old family photos for hours, looking for answers that I knew they couldn't give me. One particular image stood out, a picture of Camila holding me as a baby, smiling through tears. It was as though she knew, even then, that this moment was fleeting, that the role she was supposed to play in my life was being taken from her. I couldn't help but cry every time I looked at it. This pain wasn't just about the past. It seeped into every part of my present. My relationships felt strained. My trust in others was shaken. I started questioning whether I could ever fully trust anyone again. If the people closest to me, the ones I loved the most, could hide something so monumental, what else was anyone capable of? Despite the depth of my hurt, I knew I couldn't stay in that place forever. The pain was real and valid, but I also knew I had to start moving forward. I needed to understand who I was beyond this story, beyond the lies. But to do that, I had to first face my emotions head-on, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it was. After everything was revealed, one question became impossible to ignore. Who am I? Seems like such a simple question, but for me, it became overwhelmingly complex. My entire sense of self, everything I thought I knew about my family, my childhood, and my identity, had been shattered. I was left to pick up the pieces of a story I didn't even know I was part of. In the days and weeks that followed, I felt like I was on an emotional roller coaster. One moment I felt anger at Camila, my parents, the situation itself. The next, I felt sadness and confusion. Then there were fleeting moments of clarity, where it all seemed to make sense. But those moments were rare. Most of the time, it felt like I was trying to fit together a puzzle where half the pieces were missing. The hardest part wasn't just dealing with the pain of betrayal. It was figuring out who I was now. For years, I had believed I was the youngest daughter of my parents, the little sister of Camila. Now, I knew I was Camila's daughter. That truth reshaped everything, from my memories to my relationships. It felt like my identity had been a house built on shaky foundations, and the whole thing had crumbled. I started revisiting moments from my past, trying to make sense of them with this new perspective. I pulled out photo albums, reread old letters, and even visited places that held sentimental value from my childhood. It was like trying to rebuild a house brick by brick. But this time I was looking at everything with fresh eyes, searching for clues I hadn't seen before. Memories that once seemed insignificant now felt heavy with meaning. Like the time Camila taught me how to ride a bike and whispered, "I'll always be here for you, even when you don't know it." At the time it just felt comforting. Now it felt like a hint, a quiet truth she was trying to share. I couldn't stop wondering about my parents, the people I'd called Mom and Dad my whole life. If they weren't my biological parents, what were they to me now? Our relationship had always been distant, but this revelation added a layer of complexity I wasn't sure how to navigate. I felt a mix of anger and gratitude toward them. Anger for hiding the truth, but gratitude for taking me in and raising me. It was a strange duality that I wrestled with daily. Camila, too, became someone entirely new to me. She was no longer just my sister. She was my mother, and that changed everything. I struggled to reconcile the two versions of her in my mind. The loving sister who had always been there for me, and the young mother who had been forced to give me up. How could I view her the same way after knowing the truth? At one point, I realized I needed to talk to Camila again. Not just to confront her, but to try to rebuild our relationship in this new reality. When we met, the air between us was heavy with unspoken words. I finally asked her the question that had been haunting me. "Why didn't you fight to be my mom?" Her eyes filled with tears as she explained. "I wanted to, Manu. But I was just a teenager. I was scared. Our parents made the decision for me, and I didn't feel strong enough to fight them. I thought you'd have a better life this way." Hearing her say that didn't erase my pain, but it did help me understand her side. She wasn't just someone who had lied to me. She was someone who had made an impossible choice under immense pressure. Slowly, I started to see her not just as the person who hid the truth, but as someone who had been hurt by it, too. Rebuilding my identity wasn't just about redefining my relationships. It was also about finding out who I was outside of my family's narrative. I realized I needed to reconnect with myself, separate from everything I had been told about who I was. I started therapy, something I had never considered before. My therapist helped me see that my identity wasn't solely defined by my family or their decisions. "You're more than your story," they told me. "You get to decide what comes next." That idea became a mantra for me. I started exploring new hobbies and interests, things that felt uniquely mine. I signed up for a cooking class, volunteered at an animal shelter, and even tried yoga for the first time. Each small step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, like planting seeds for a new version of who I wanted to be. Rebuilding my identity also meant confronting the past. I decided to ask my parents, my adoptive parents, about their side of the story. My mom told me about the fear she felt when she took me in, knowing the burden of raising someone else's child. I did it because I loved Camila, and I wanted to protect you, she said, her voice heavy with regret. But I know now that hiding the truth was a mistake. Hearing her admit that was both painful and healing. It didn't erase the hurt, but it showed me that even she carried the weight of the secret. My dad, who had always been reserved, opened up as well. We thought we were doing the right thing, but we were wrong. I hope one day you can forgive us, he said. Those words stayed with me. Rebuilding wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I learned to accept that my identity wasn't about where I came from, but about where I was going. Camila and I started spending more time together. Not just to talk about the past, but to create new memories. One weekend we went to the beach, a place she used to visit as a teenager. Walking along the shore, she told me stories about her youth. Stories she had never shared before. For the first time I felt like I was truly getting to know her. This process of rebuilding my identity taught me one important lesson. Your past shapes you, but it doesn't define you. I realized I had the power to take the pieces of my story and build something new, something entirely my own. And that realization gave me hope. Forgiveness isn't easy. Honestly, I never realized how difficult it could be until I found myself needing to forgive the people I loved most. After everything that had been revealed, I carried the weight of anger, betrayal, and sadness everywhere I went. It wasn't just Camila, it was my parents, my entire family dynamic, and even myself. The pain was overwhelming, but deep down, I knew that holding on to it would only hurt me more. Forgiveness wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about finding a way to move forward. The first step toward reconciliation came from Camila. After weeks of limited communication and awkward silences, she finally sent me a message. Can we talk again? Just you and me. My first instinct was to ignore her. I was still angry, and the thought of rehashing everything seemed unbearable. But a part of me knew I needed to hear her out. So I agreed. We met at a park, a place that held so many happy childhood memories for us. I sat on the same bench where she used to tie my shoelaces when I was little. The weight of what I now knew made even that simple memory feel heavy. At first, neither of us said anything. Then Camila broke the silence. Manu, I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back, she began, her voice trembling. I'm not here to make excuses. I just want you to know that I've always loved you, even if I couldn't show it the way I wanted to. Hearing her say those words broke something inside me. For so long, I had been consumed by my own pain that I hadn't allowed myself to see hers. For the first time, I realized that she wasn't just the person who lied to me. She was also someone who had been living with the burden of that lie for decades. Camila told me about the years she spent watching me grow up, longing to be more than just my sister. She described how every milestone in my life was bittersweet for her. Pride mixed with the sting of not being able to claim me as her own. I made a choice, she said, tears streaming down her face. I thought it was the best thing for you, but it wasn't the best thing for either of us. Her vulnerability softened something in me. I wasn't ready to forgive her completely, but I could see her pain more clearly now. It was a small step, but it was enough for us to begin rebuilding our relationship. We started spending more time together, not to dwell on the past but to create new memories. One day, she suggested we try painting together at a local art studio. It felt strange at first, like we were tiptoeing around an invisible barrier. But by the end of the day, we were laughing and covered in paint, just like we used to be when I was a kid. For the first time in months, I felt like we were reconnecting, not as sister and daughter but as mother and child. Forgiving my parents was a different challenge altogether. While I could understand Camila's choices as a scared teenager, it was harder to reconcile my parents' role in the deception. They were the adults, the ones who were supposed to protect me and guide me. Instead, they had built an entire narrative to cover up the truth. It felt like a betrayal on a completely different level. But as I started having honest conversations with them, I began to see things differently. My mother confessed how hard it was for her to take on the role of my mom, knowing I wasn't biologically hers. "I loved you like my own," she said. "But there were days when I wondered if you could feel the difference." My dad, who had always been so stoic, admitted that he carried immense guilt for keeping the secret. "I thought we were protecting you," he said. "But looking back, I see we were just protecting ourselves." Hearing their regrets didn't erase the hurt, but it opened a door to understanding. They weren't perfect, and their decisions had caused me pain, but they had also loved me in their own flawed way. It wasn't a sudden shift. Forgiveness crept in slowly, through small moments of vulnerability and honesty. Over time, those moments began to outweigh the anger. The journey toward forgiveness wasn't just about them, it was also about forgiving myself. I realized I had been blaming myself in subtle ways, wondering if I had missed the signs or if I wasn't worth being fought for. Letting go of that guilt was one of the hardest parts of the process. But as I worked through it, I began to feel lighter. Rebuilding my family relationships was a slow, deliberate process. We started small, a dinner here, a phone call there. Camila and I took long walks together, talking about everything from childhood memories to dreams for the future. My parents and I started having open conversations about the past, something we had never done before. Little by little, we began to heal. One of the most transformative moments came during a family lunch. We were all sitting around the table, Camila, my parents, and me, when my dad raised his glass and said, "To new beginnings." It was a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. For the first time, I felt like we were all on the same page. Not trying to erase the past, but choosing to move forward together. Forgiveness didn't erase the scars, but it allowed me to live with them. They became a part of my story, not something that defined me but something that shaped me. And in that, I found a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. With forgiveness came a sense of freedom. For the first time in my life, I felt like I could live authentically, without the weight of secrets holding me down. The truth had been painful to uncover, but it also gave me a foundation to build something new, a life rooted in honesty and love. Camila and I began a new chapter in our relationship. She wasn't just my sister anymore. She was my mother, and we were learning how to navigate that together. We started creating new traditions: weekend breakfasts, art projects, even a short trip to a beach town she loved as a teenager. Each shared moment felt like a step toward healing. My relationship with my parents also shifted. While the hurt from their decisions hadn't completely disappeared, I could see their efforts to make amends. They were trying, and that mattered. Slowly, I started to let them back into my heart. But the biggest change was within me. I realized that my identity wasn't tied to the secrets or lies. It was something I could define for myself. I started pursuing hobbies I had always been curious about, like yoga and volunteering at an animal shelter. These small, personal victories helped me rebuild my sense of self piece by piece. The scars of my past will always be there, but they no longer feel like weights. Instead, they're reminders of how far I've come. My family and I still have moments of difficulty, but we're learning to be honest with each other. And in that honesty, we've found a new kind of love, one that's imperfect but real.